So now you know. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Our topic today is what's in a question, boosting ELL's comprehension success on HiSET test questions. So as you can see from the title, the focus will be on the HiSET. So we're going to talk a little bit about what HiSET is, and then kind of go through the item types and question types and what kind of challenges ELs might face with each type of the question in today's session. So we're really happy for you to join us. My name is Heidi Banerjee, and with me is Lindy Alwood. I'm the second matrician of HiSET. It's a title that nobody knows what it's about. So basically, my job is to do data analysis to make sure the tests work properly, and also I assemble the test to make sure that Form A, Form C are all equal or fair. That's what I do. And here we have Lindy, who is the scoring manager of HiSET, so she oversees all the human scores of the essay portion of HiSET. All right. So we cover. Oh, next. We worked just a second ago. Anyway. I'm done. We had the same problem yesterday. Make sure your mouse is actually on the slide. And then try. Where's the mouse? Okay, let me try it again. I'm just gonna. It's not even working with this. Oh, there you go. Okay. All right. But we already talked about this, so we didn't spend too much time on this clicking thing. So I'm just gonna go ahead and provide an overview of HiSET. I'm not sure if everybody is familiar with HiSET, so I'm just gonna give you a very broad overview of what each subject is about. So HiSET, we have 5 subjects. We have math, science, social studies, and for ELA, we break it down to reading and writing, so there are 2 separate tests. And as you can see, for each subject, we have from 50 to 61 questions. Writing has 61 questions just because it has 60 multiple choice plus an essay. Okay, and the time varies by subject. And for reading, we actually have a different time allowance for English and Spanish, just because Spanish might need more time to read. But usually it's about 60 minutes to 120 minutes for each subject. Right? Okay. And we're going to break the presentation down to talk about math, science, and social studies first, and how they might pose challenges to ELLs, because they are more kind of the challenges are a little different from what the ELLs might face with reading and writing, which is more language-based. So I think the challenges are slightly different between the first 3 subjects and the latter 2 subjects. So we're going to separate the 2 to make it into 2 broad portions of our presentation. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the math test. Okay, so this is the test at a glance. As you can see, we have, for math, there's 4 different content categories that test takers need to be able to demonstrate the ability in. And they have different process categories that are related to the math abilities. Okay, so what exactly are test takers asked to do? Okay, so first they're asked to show that they understand mathematical concepts and procedures. Okay, so I highlight the verb. So while you're looking at the verb, think about how that might affect test takers who speak English as a second language. Okay, so they have to select appropriate procedures. They have to identify examples and counterexamples of concepts. And then they also need to analyze and interpret information. So they need to make inferences or predictions based on the data or information. They need to interpret data from a variety of sources. And they need to also synthesize data and solve problems. Okay, so they need to reason quantitatively and evaluate the reasonableness of solutions. Okay, so all these are related to our math test. Okay, so here's a sample item. I don't know if you can see clearly, but I underline the vocabulary word that are more disciplinary specific. Okay, so as you can see, there's a graph and there's some description of the graph above. Okay, so with these type of math items, you can kind of envision some kind of some potential challenges for ELs might include they have to understand subject-specific vocabulary or phrases to be able to solve, right? If they don't understand function, they don't understand coordinate plane, then they might have a little bit of issue solving this problem if they don't even understand what the question is asking, right? And then after that, they need to analyze and interpret the graph. Okay, so these are, sorry, I need to go back. So these are the kind of challenges ELs might face with these type of question, but these are kind of simple. It's just a small question and a graph. So usually it's not that daunting for ELs, but still we need to recognize that their vocabulary words that they might need to know, and they also have that processing going on in their head to be able to analyze the graph. Okay, this is another math sample item. Okay, so we have a small description of the item from above, and then we have the formula, and then we have more questions, and then the options. So potential challenges for ELs with these type of math questions include, again, understanding subject-specific vocabulary. So you can see they need to understand polygon, translated, because translated here is not really the translation that we usually use in our daily life context, right? Translated kind of means a little differently in a math context. And there's also coordinate plane again, so they need to understand all that. Making inferences based on the given information. Okay, so they need to read all the information that was provided for them.
So it did not start the web version of the presentation.
Oh.
Technical difficulties again. One moment.
But it's recorded.
It did say it's recording, but we have someone online that can't hear it.
Oh.
So we're waiting for the host to start the.
Wait.
For the host to start the.
But we are there. Hold on.
I've got a problem with the podium mic as well. Do you have a hand mic?
Oh.
Use the hand mic.
What about now?
So these are potential challenges for the HiSET.
What the joy of technology. Okay, so they couldn't hear me.
She has not responded back.
Okay.
That was our problem yesterday.
Okay, hopefully this will solve the problem. Okay, for our audience who's joining us remotely, can you please verify if you can hear me now?
Do you want to keep going and we'll try to problem solve with them?
Sure. Okay, great. All right, so just to kind of recap where we're at right now, we talked a little bit about the overview of HiSET, and now we're talking about some potential challenges ELLs might face with some simple math items. Okay, so continuing with this slide. Okay. No, it doesn't go. Ugh. Come on. All right, okay. Now, okay, so another type of math item, which is, as you can see from the screen, is a lot more wordier than the two previous examples, is like a word problem. Okay, so you can see that there's a scenario. So you describe like a maybe real life scenario, and then they have to buy something, purchase stuff, or they have to like ride a bike somewhere and then calculate the kilometer. Okay, so you can see like there's the description of the scenario, and then there's the question, and then there are 5 options here. They're all very wordy. Okay, but this is just a typical word problem in the context of math test. Okay, so but Potential challenges for ELLs then, as you can imagine, is to understand the scenario. Okay, they need to be able to read the whole thing and understand what's going on and what's asked of them, and process and analyze the presented information, interpret the options and make decisions, which one is the correct answer, right? And then another one is the use of commas and decimals. So we put it there, which is not really reflected in the sample, is because we know how, like in English, we do a comma for large numbers of every 3 digits, and it is not always the case for other languages. So for test takers who are from a different background and who are not taught such a difference, they might have some difficulty processing a chunk of numbers with different kind of, comma and decimals point going on. Okay, so that's something that we just need to be aware of, and then be able to tell our students that this is something you have to expect and understand that will be in the test. Okay, and moving on to science. So this is our science test. Test takers will be given 80 minutes. There are 60 questions. And then as you can see, there are 3 different categories. There's life science, physical science, and earth science. So what are students asked to do in our science test? Okay, so again, think about what that might affect ELLs while you read the description. So they first have to interpret and apply. What do they do? Interpret observed data and information and apply scientific principles. They also need to analyze again, discern an appropriate research question suggested by the information presented, identify reasons for a procedure, analyzing limitations, and select the best procedures. They also need to evaluate and generalize. They have to be able to distinguish among hypotheses, assumptions, data, and conclusions, judge the basis of information for a given conclusion, determine relevance for answering a question, and judge the reliability of sources. So that's a lot of things students have to be able to do, right? So this is, again, a scenario. Okay, so for our science test, this is just one item type. And then I only put partial because this is not the entirety of the item. Okay, so as you can see, there's a description. Okay, so they talked about the context, and then they showed a picture, a graph, and then more context. And then there's actually more context that I cropped out. And then there's a table there that test takers need to be able to understand what's going on, what kind of data is presented to them. Okay. And then this is a sample item related to that scenario that I just showed. Okay, so as you can see, again, there's a lot of words here to describe the question, and then there are options here. Okay. So potential challenges for ELLs. Again, understanding subject-specific vocabulary. Okay, then there are a lot of things going on in that scenario. They have to read and analyze and evaluate and understand the data that's presented to them and be able to kind of choose the best answer. That's just, for ELs, that's a lot of processing going on in their little brain. And then process and analyze information in the graph or table, so I just mentioned that. And also process and analyze the presented information. So that's kind of like all happening at the same time. And interpret the options and making decisions, okay? Here's another scenario that's in the science test. So all of the scenarios that I posted, sample scenarios I posted here are from our practice test. So they're actual practice test items or scenarios. Okay, and then here I underline the disciplinary specific vocabulary words. So you can see there are actually quite a few words that are science specific. Okay, so 4 paragraphs of the scenario description, and then all those words that the test takers need to be able to understand, to be able to process. And there's another item here. Okay, so potential challenges for ELLs again include understanding vocabulary phrases, process and analyze information in a text-heavy scenario, so they can have to read a lot of things. And then they have to evaluate and judge the presented information, and then process and interpret the options and making decisions. Okay, so that's a lot of processing and analyzing for for ELLs. So it's already kind of difficult and challenging for students who speak English as a first language. And then now for ELLs, there's an added layer of challenge to have to process all that language to be able to solve that issue. Okay, and then now let's continue with social studies. So social studies, we have 60 questions and 7 minutes of allowance. Okay, and in the social studies test, we have history items, civics or government, economics, and geography. So there are 4 types of test questions. What are test takers asked to do? So again, they have to interpret and apply. Okay, they have to make inferences and predictions based on data or information. They have to infer unstated relationships. They have to extend conclusions or related phenomena. They also have to analyze by distinguishing among facts, opinions, or values, or by recognizing the author's purpose, assumptions, or arguments. Okay, and they also need to evaluate and generalize. Okay, so they have to determine the adequacy of information for reaching conclusions, judge the validity of conclusions, and compare and contrast the reliability of sources. Okay, so those are pretty high-level things that they have to be able to demonstrate. Okay, so this is a sample scenario. So this is it looks very simple, it's just a picture, right? So it's a poster, okay? But what kind of challenge might an ELL face when, even with such a simple scenario where just a poster is presented? Okay, so there might be some specific vocabulary phrases. Again, I keep talking about it, but it's just so important. They have to understand the modality of scenario presentation. So they might not be familiar with like a poster or like, someone running for an election poster, that kind of thing. Just might not be something that they're familiar with without explicit instruction, right? And then they need to also be able to relate to their background or cultural knowledge. Okay, is it something that they are familiar with from based on where they're from or based on their age group? Okay, maybe for our younger test takers, it might be something that they're not super familiar with. Okay, and then this is a sample item related to the previous poster. Okay, so you can see here, there's the question. The question is short, so maybe it's not too difficult for them to analyze what the question is asking, but there are so many words that test takers might need to be able to understand before they're able to select the best option, right? There's union, public affairs, advocate, property taxes, endorsement. So those are the things that test takers might not necessarily understand if they're not familiar with those political phrases or vocabulary. Okay. So potential challenges for ELLs, and they have to make inferences based on the information, understanding the vocabulary, and make inferences based on information. Oh, I already said that. Wait, so that's ignore that one. And be able to distinguish among facts, opinions, and values. Okay, so we have that kind of just one poster or one graph kind of item type in our social studies test, but we also have this kind of item type, which shows the test takers a really long paragraph describing an incident or a historical event or a policy. And then for them to, they have to read through the passage and then answer questions based on the passage, right? So as you can see, this is pretty wordy. There's a lot of information presented in this kind of scenario. Okay, so they need to understand the phrases or vocabulary that's specific to that particular context, okay, and then processing and analyzing information in a text-heavy scenario, and evaluate and judge the presented information. Okay, so there's a lot of things that test takers have to be able to demonstrate to succeed in our test. Okay, so now that we've identified challenges that ELLs might face when answering these type of questions in our math, science, and social studies test, how can we help? I think that's probably why you're here. Just want to know how can we help our ELLs succeed so that they don't feel that this is so daunting for them. They feel confident coming into our test. Okay, so the first one we really recommend is to explicitly teach subject-specific vocabulary and phrases. Okay, I know in like second language research, there's a lot of recommendations on like, implicit instruction, like, just read a lot and test takers, the students will pick up the vocabulary as they are exposed to the materials, that kind of thing. But for a test prep or for a very discipline-specific kind of vocabulary, we really recommend explicit instruction. Okay, they would really benefit on explicit instruction because then they know what to expect and they know what exactly that phrase or vocabulary word means. And contextualize the problems to make them more relatable to ELLs. So think about your where your students are from. Like, you might all deal with different students with different backgrounds. Some are maybe from Asian countries, some are from South America, some are from maybe African countries. So they might all from different places, and they have different background, they have different understandings. So maybe contextualize the questions so that it's more familiar to your students first, and then make them feel comfortable with that kind of scenario or question type before moving on to the real kind of more, I was Americanized, probably not the right word, but just something that's more like, fit into our current society. Okay. And scaffold. Okay, scaffold. So you don't have to throw the whole passage to them at once, right? You can break them down into small pieces and give them one piece at a time. They're okay, and then a little more, a little more, a little more. Okay, so scaffold the instruction by working on simpler questions first and gradually increasing the amount of information and difficulty. And deconstruct the information presented in a text-heavy scenario and prompt questions. Okay, so again, you don't have to give them the whole thing at once. Like, if you recall the big scenario in the science sample item that I presented earlier, they have like text and then a picture and then more text and a table. You don't need to show them the whole thing at the same time. Okay, just maybe process one thing, okay, and then you can ask students, what do you know about this? And then give them more, and then give them the picture, and give them the table. Okay, so one thing at a time, like mini lessons, maybe that'll be more helpful, and they will just feel less scared. And read aloud. Okay, have your students read aloud, not you read aloud, not the teachers. Ask the students to read aloud the information and passages and questions during the test prep, because when they read aloud, their brain actually have to actively engage in the information that's presented in the item or scenario. This enhances cognitive processing. So read aloud has shown to be really helpful for ELLs to process like math or science or social studies, that kind of information. Okay, and help your student identify the real question. Okay, so even though a lot of the items or questions have long passages, usually the real question is the last sentence before the options, right? So maybe have them find the real question first, and then go back to read about the context so they know what is actually asked of them, and then they can kind of process the context a little better, knowing what is asked of them. Okay, and with that, I'm going to give the floor to my colleague, Lindy, and who will talk about reading and writing.
Thank you. Before we move on, were there any specific questions about these subjects? Don't want you to forget about them if you do have them. Okay, so ELA, as Heidi said, is reading and writing separated. Focusing on reading specifically, we have two text types, literary text, informational texts, and those can be broken down to narratives, poems, all of that. But often we find ELLs specifically really struggle with the informational texts because those are the ones that have the heavier vocabulary that are specific to whatever the topic is at hand. And then it has the process categories. I do want to call out, these are highly related to the standards that we are using. So if you look at our test at a glance, you will see this, and then all of the standards that we have, and you can see more of that pulled out to see how the cognitive demand is developed throughout the standards. And so as Heidi said, we have the verbs for what they're doing, and we start with the lower cognitive demand of comprehension, where they basically are demonstrating understanding of words and details in the text. That then takes us to inference and interpretation, where they have to use a little more cognitive demand to make and support inferences, interpret information, infer traits and feelings. And this is one that I will also say has some subject-specific vocab that our test takers would need, because if they don't know what infer means and the question is asking them to infer, how can they answer it if they have no idea what the basic concept of the question is? At the analysis level, determining the main idea, author's perspective or viewpoint, seeing how the text or analyzing how it develops, recognizing tone, and then evaluating the use of the literary devices that the author might use. And finally, that critical thinking of drawing conclusions, synthesizing the information to make predictions, compare and contrast multiple elements. Specifically comparing and contrasting, we will have passages, 2 passages, and they have to draw on both of them to answer a question. Again, taking that to analyzing how they present the similar information. And then here is an example scenario. So you know our reading section is going to be text heavy. It will have a lot of information, and you can't always teach the subject-specific vocab, because something like out-of-place artifacts, which this is from one of our free practice tests, has a lot of words that may be unfamiliar. But specifically when working with ELLs, I think it's helpful when you're talking about how to prepare for the reading test, we often reference specific lines. So I would suggest going ahead, reading the questions first, because then you can highlight and look, where are we actually focusing on when we take the test? And these common challenges, they're similar as with the other subjects. They might have a limited vocabulary. There are complex sentence structures within our passages. Their reading speed and fluency alone, it is text heavy. There are multiple passages that they have to read and understand and maybe reread to answer the questions. The differences in culture, not having the prior knowledge on what we're talking about, or even academic English that is used. Specifically, again, going to those informational texts and having topics that might be something we don't talk about often. Not being familiar with the genre, and then the text length and complexity. So helping ELLs prepare, often it's a lot of pre-reading activities and starting with the basics. What do we know about this topic? Activating prior knowledge. Students might feel like they don't have prior knowledge, but we can always make a connection. There's always something that we can get them to see that they know about a subject. And then using the skills of previewing a text and looking for those textual features, headings, subheadings, images, bolded, italicized. They're put that way for a reason. Working with them to realize, okay, it's set up like this because the author wants to do such and such. And then vocabulary building. I talked about inferring. That's a word they need to understand. Tone. They need to understand what tone is, so when we ask, what is the author's tone, they can have an idea of what they're looking for. And then how can you use context clues to guess the meaning of a word? And with everything with ELLs, breaking it down, scaffolding, particularly reading, they don't have to read the whole passage at once. Read a paragraph, focus on that, summarize it to yourself, and move on to the next one. Start with simple sentences and work your way up as you're teaching. But especially encourage students to ask questions. When you're reading, don't just read. Stop and think. What do I expect to learn? What just happened? What's surprising about this? What do I think will come next? And then these are really just active reading strategies. When they take our test, if it's on paper, they have a pencil, they can underline. When they take it on the computer, they can follow along with the cursor and make sure they're seeing it. You can't necessarily read aloud in the actual test, but moving your mouth, pretending you're reading aloud, because as Heidi said, that does make you draw in on it. especially if you think about when you write something and you go to double check it and you miss all these things because in your mind, yeah, it looks good, I figured it out. We need to do the same with our students and summarizing in their own words. And then sometimes, as we already said, using those text features, breaking them down, paying attention to any graphics or visuals, focus on the headings and subheadings to see what the main ideas will be that are coming up. And for those unfamiliar contexts, providing that background knowledge, helping them understand cultural cues and how these relate to real life experiences, and just helping keep students engaged with reading. With this all too, post-reading activities, small group discussions, written responses, especially helpful considering there is a writing section, and connecting ideas to what they've already learned or things that they've seen. And I think that leads in nicely to writing. One thing different about writing that you'll see here is the others had process categories that were related to those verbs. Here it has content categories that's more based on what would be included within writing. So the development of ideas or claims, organization, language, grammar, writing conventions. And that would make the writing section probably a little more difficult for our ELLs because not only is it understanding and reading something, it's then checking and correcting. So they not only have to understand the meaning of the passage and the context of a word or a phrase, they have to try to improve it because we present them as drafts and say, hey, correct these certain questions that we're going to highlight for you. They also then need to recognize any incorrect grammar, spelling, sentence structure, any words that might be used incorrectly. Again, this is a little more difficult, but if you think about the standards when teaching writing, you can't forget about the basics in this case. Because if you look at our test at a glance again, you'll see basic things like subject-verb agreement all the way down to transitions, prepositions, all of that. So you can't forget that subject-verb agreement that's built upon as you go in your teaching. And then analyze, choosing the best option, knowing why that's the best option. Understanding how different answer options could affect the text in terms of tone, correctness, flow, organization, and choosing more precise words to use in certain situations. Then for the essay, this is the only productive part of the actual test. So they've gone through, they've done all the multiple choice where they've read something that someone else wrote and see our suggestions for fixing, and now they have to read it 2 passages, take a position, and then write an essay arguing their stance. So this involves comprehension of the topic at hand, organizing ideas, so ideally brainstorming beforehand, drawing on those ideas and what the text provides, and then evaluating arguments and putting it in their own writing. So this includes organization, argumentation, thinking about writing, thinking about what they're doing, proofreading and correcting their own errors, and managing their time. There's 120 minutes, and there is 60 multiple choice and then an essay to write, and sometimes students struggle with time management. They don't know whether they should start with the essay or the multiple choice, and that's something that could really help ELLs if they learn how to function within that specific time period, how to organize their ideas so they can write quickly and effectively and have time to answer all the questions. Here's an example of what they would see on our writing test. So typically we present the passages twice. Once it'll be the full passage without any indication of where the questions are. And then they'll see it again, and the passage will be on the left for paper, on the right for our computer-based, and something will be highlighted. Sometimes it won't even have a question here. They just have to read and understand that we're saying there might be a mistake here. So you have to identify what it is and then fix it. And the other tricky part is maybe there's no mistake. Maybe it's best as is, and they have to recognize that nothing would improve this. Another point to call out is there will be more mistakes in the draft we present than we will have questions. So while they might be fixing one thing, Don't let them get caught up in trying to fix all of it, because that's not what we're asking about. We have 60 questions, and we're only asking, 10 or so per passage? So they need to focus on what we're really calling out to improve. Then here's what the essay would look like. They get some instructions, and then we present two passages on a certain topic. Looking at it more, so we have our general instructions. Here are some essays. You're going to read and then put forth an essay where you argue your point. The second paragraph will tell you what the topic is of each one. The first one says this, the second one says this. And then after the passages, they'll see more instructions where it's saying, here's what you need to do. You need to write an essay in which you argue your position on topic here. Make sure you use evidence and discuss the opposing side. And then check your writing for grammar, spelling, mechanics. It sounds like a challenging test, doesn't it? Writing's hard. Especially hard if you don't know the idioms that we are using. This is when those context clues really help, or even summarizing and understanding the entire passage and the tone to recognize, what does this idiom mean? Often we'll say, if you were to replace it with something more fitting, what would that be? So they have to understand what they're trying to get across with the idiom, and then what would improve it to match the tone. There's grammar that doesn't exist in every language. So learning that grammar in English and then trying to process it in your native language and then fix it on something on paper. Just subtle errors that we as native English speakers make all the time that we might not recognize. There's cultural differences in writing style. Some languages are very flowery and flowy, and we want to provide all the details, and maybe we'll get to the point eventually, and others are more straightforward. The conventions of standard written English are often very difficult. Sometimes, as the scoring manager, I will look at essays and I will see long paragraphs where it's just comma, 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 period at the end. And it's really 5 sentences that should have been punctuated differently. Some have difficulty taking a side, or they think that what they say will be incorrect. There is no right or wrong in their opinion. Make sure they know that. We just want to see that they have an opinion and they support it. Also, they might not know much about the topic we provide, but that's okay. They have 2 passages that give information. They don't need to say, I don't know anything about this. I'll just try again next time. I've seen that in essays where they say, I'll just fail this time. They could have passed. They could have stated, I agree with this, and here's a couple reasons why. And then we talked about time management, being able to take the entire test, and then also write an essay. So helping with this, teaching grammar, it's not everyone's favorite thing to learn, but it is helpful in this sense. Reviewing and practicing, repetition, timed practice. We do have practice tests available on our website. We have half-length ones, and then we also have full-length ones. Full-length might be good when your students near the time of, I think I'm ready, to sit down and actually go through an entire session and see what it would be like. Understanding reading and writing actually go hand in hand. The reading test might seem a little easier because all you have to do is read, but then the writing test, you have to read. The other test, you actually have to read a lot. And understanding that this is a text-heavy bundle of tests, but they're able to do it. They just need to know the strategies to get there. Using mini lessons. If you weren't able to attend, we actually presented yesterday talking about strategies for essay writing. I would suggest that because we go into mini lessons more. We did upload our PDFs and everything to the Whova app, so make sure you look and find it. If you can't, come see us at the booth. We're happy to help you find it to break it down a little more. And just break down the instructions. Use those practice tests because the instructions we use there mirror what's on the actual test. There shouldn't be any surprises in terms of what they're going to see. And just make sure students get feedback on what they're doing. Again, this is in the other presentation, so I won't go into it too much, but just making sure the feedback gives them something to action. Because oftentimes students think feedback is a grade. a grade doesn't help them because it doesn't tell them what to do to improve. And then just help students become familiar with our scoring guide. We have it. It's on the website. There are 6 points there for scoring our essays. They're actually pretty straightforward. And we've seen students who think that simply using 2 quotes means they pass. But it's how you use those quotes, it's how you incorporate it with your opinion that make a difference. So in all, one thing, again, we talked about in the other presentation, but that I'll bring up, a lot of what we need to do to help our ELLs and actually any students we have is to work on metacognition, to think about what they're doing. They have the strategies, you've worked with them, they just need to believe in themselves and have that self-talk, one, where they go into a test positive and not thinking, I'm gonna fail, I don't know how to do this. They do, right? We all have the skills, we gave them the skills, they just need to believe in themselves. And they can do this through more self-reflection with that feedback that you give them, and just self-awareness of the strategies that you have taught in class, that they are using that voice in their head to say, okay, to write an essay, I'm going to do this first, and then I will do this, and be more prepared. They have the skills. I believe in you all as educators, and I believe in them. We just need to make them believe in themselves a little bit more. That's all we have for this today. Happy to answer any questions that you all have about this or other HiSET related questions. Or if you want to come chat at the booth, we'll be there all day. Yeah. Can I bring you the mic because we do have someone online?
So random question about the math formula sheet. Sorry. Hi, I teach all the subjects. Math is the worst for us. So question about the math formula sheet. Are they ever gonna add the quadratic formula and rate of change formula onto the sheet? Just out of curiosity.
We don't have any plans on adding that. I would say those are, we have very basic formulas on there, right? And that they're supposed to use those and take them to the next level with more advanced things like the quadratic formula. I don't know if you have more to add.
And usually if students need to use a formula that's not already on the formula sheet, it's actually, the formula itself is actually part of, embedded in the question. So it's very rare that we ask students to come up with the formula out of their memory without providing any assistance. So I think the assistance is there, and if we ever need them to be able to apply any more complicated formula, it will be provided in the question. Yeah, on the actual test, it will be provided in the item.
Nothing else. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it.
Thank you.